Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Kidney Coach YouTube channel. I am blessed to be joined again today by Dr. Morgan Camp. Dr. Morgan Camp is an integrative practitioner, has been practicing for well more than 20 years. He's an absolute gift to the world in his ability to help support people through really complex conditions and diseases. And he's been on our podcast. This is number 3 now, so we feel very grateful to have him here. I'll put all his information below, and if you want to listen to some other podcasts that we did, the first one, he really introduced himself and gave us an overview. But today we want to tackle hormones and the role that they play in chronic disease, especially related to kidney disease, heart disease, and diabetes, which are the 2 major drivers of chronic kidney disease. So I think I might just hand it over to you, Dr. Camp, and we'll get into it. So tell me, hormones, why are they so important when it comes to aging, health, longevity, and chronic diseases, especially these ones related to kidney disease?
Great, thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I'll just dive right in. Yeah, when I am looking at patients, I'm looking at all these different levels and layers of health, because there's so many different systems, and to break it down so I can understand it, so people can understand, like break it down into little digestible chunks. So the first one that I look at on all my patients is their hormones. Also for me, I've had a lot of great training in hormones and hormone therapies by various doctors, including one of my favorites, who's pretty out there by most doctors. And here's a book of his, Dr. Terry Hertoghe. Learned a lot from Dr. Hertoghe. His great-grandfather, his either grandfather or great-grandfather, was the first doctor to prescribe thyroid treatment for the diagnosis of hypothyroidism. He's in Belgium. And so he's been this family lineage of hormone specialists. And I show you this big book because he's got half of this book are just the references to all the diseases that ensue when your hormones are out of balance.
Wow.
And he's for every hormone he goes through, and he talks about how each hormone is associated with increased aging, X, Y, Z disease, and we'll go through a few of those examples. And then perhaps we can go through some very common symptoms of hormone imbalances, probably many of which your clients are aware of, and also like how to diagnose them, and like what labs look like, and which labs you should order, and what to do if you can't get your doctor to order them, or they're not ordering the right ones, or you just don't know. So I can give you a list of like what the right ones are to order. It's such a gray area. And then a few tidbits around like the testing procedure. Remind me of that if I forget, Fiona, like how to properly do hormone testing. That's one of my specialties too. We can go through some of these. So the most common hormone imbalances are thyroid disease and adrenal disease. And on adrenal disease, you can have too high of cortisol, too low of cortisol. There are other adrenal hormones, DHEA being the more prevalent one, in cortisol, but typically talking about cortisol here. The low cortisol section is very much overlooked by mainstream medicine. The diagnosis of low cortisol exists if you have something called Addison's disease, and very few people are diagnosed with that, even if they have it, until they're nearly dead or die from it. Whereas a lot of people have high cortisol, they actually feel great and love it, and they don't go to the doctor at all because they feel great all the time, despite the consequences of high cortisol. So we can dive into these a bit. Maybe we'll start with thyroid, because that's fresh in my mind right now. So thyroid disease and aging. So not only is thyroid disease, we know that untreated or poorly treated thyroid disease puts you at higher risk for type 2 diabetes and high blood sugar. So in these references here, Dr. Hertoghe has them. Not only is it if you're not treated, you're at higher risk, but again, if you're not treated appropriately. So Dr. Hertog has a lot of references here showing when you're treated for low thyroid, you want your free levels to be in the upper 25th percentile. Meaning when you look at the reference range and the normal reference range is way too big, the normal reference range for thyroid disease is basically a population average. It is not ideal. It is not optimal. It is not healthy. The healthy range is really like from the 50th percentile onward. Now, some people can't tolerate being at the higher percentile of the dosing because they may have insomnia or palpitations, things like that. But I don't push it quite as far as Dr. Hertog, just because my patients seem to be more sensitive. But I try to get people at least to the 50th percentile. So for like a free T3, that's like a 3.2. And I think it's the same in Australia, the same numbers, as I just looked at my patient from Australia's labs a few minutes ago, and it was 3.2.
Yeah, they would have the same ranges.
You want to be right around 3.2 or higher. You don't want to be 2.6, 2.8. That's just not good enough.
And what about TSH? Sorry to interrupt you, because I know, this is my bugbear that we get results in and doctors like, you're in the reference range in their TSH. And again, TSH doesn't tell us much because that's all that doctors will do, is just telling us what the curature is pushing out, doesn't give us anything about the thyroid. But the reference range is, I think, 0.8 to 5. And we know the World Health Organization says anything over 2.5. So, which is almost everybody comes back with their labs over 2.5 and they're undiagnosed and doctors say, you're fine. Is that something you find as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when I started my practice, I was in an area of a lot of affluency and also intelligent people. And they were all, I was the only doctor for some reason that would prescribe thyroid medication, it seemed like, in the county. So I got all these people who came in, and it was, and then, so I was just seeing patient after patient with untreated thyroid disease. And yeah, many of them have a TSH around 2.8, 3, et cetera. And I would treat them. And then I forget what year it was. It might've been 2011, 2012, the World Thyroid Organization, or I forget the name. That's not the correct name. There's a large organization that said, if your TSH is greater than 2.5 and you have symptoms of low thyroid, you should consider a trial of treatment. So that's how I treat my patients. We're calling this a trial of treatment. I don't know if you're going to get better with this or not. But let's give it a try. And when you start thyroid medication, you always start with a low dose, and then you always increase it up until the point where you might get some discomfort or symptoms of too much, and then you want to back down. And why do I do it like that? Well, because if I give you a low dose and then recheck your labs, guess what? It's going to come back normal because that reference range is this big. And that's what a lot of doctors do every day. They just give the first dose, the low dose they can. They say, oh, your labs look great. Have a good day. So what I do is, I follow the symptoms a person has that I think are associated with the thyroid disease. And I watch those over time, and we track those as we're adjusting the dose, and they go away. And, as they go away, and then, okay, if one of the 5 symptoms doesn't go away, maybe it's related to something else, because there's a lot of overlap between low thyroid symptoms and other illnesses, right? Or other diseases or whatever. So, that's how I approach it. And you have to do that. You got to start low, slowly increase the dose over time. Don't have a lab checked until you've been on a stable dose for at least 6 weeks, because it takes that long to come to equilibrium. Don't take your thyroid med the day you take your blood test, because then you're going to have high levels and the doctor's going to lower your dose because of that. Don't do that. So that's really critical mistakes. And no, doctors don't talk about this to their patients ever, and so I've just seen, I've literally treated thousands of people with thyroid disease and seen I've seen every type of illness. I've seen many Hashimoto's patients. And for your listeners out there, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune thyroiditis, often caused by a viral infection like Epstein-Barr virus. So I always check thyroid peroxidase antibodies for patients. So my typical lab panel is a TSH, a free T3, a free T4, that thyroid peroxidase antibody. I also like to check reverse T3, especially if anyone is obese or has other inflammatory illness or looks or sounds inflamed, because often that reverse T3 will be high and everything else will look fine.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's how I go through it and look at it. And yeah, it's fascinating topic. When thyroid is not treated appropriately, you're high risk for high blood sugar and type 2 diabetes. You're also at higher risk for kidney disease. I think it's both related to the high blood sugar and diabetes and independent of that. I do believe that your thyroid is signaling the growth. I mean, it's for all of our organs, the thyroid is critical for cellular growth and repair. And when it's not working, all the organs will decline. All of them will.
Makes sense why it's such an important one. And when you have a client sitting in front of you, what would alert you to someone potentially having their thyroid out? If people are out there thinking, oh, maybe I should get mine checked. What are you sort of talked about some big symptoms that are obvious, and it can obviously, you should just check it anyway, is what I'm hearing. But what symptoms are if people are out there thinking, oh, what if my thyroid's out? What would they be looking for?
Fatigue, of course, is the big one.
Mm-hmm.
Constipation is the other one. Low body temperature. So you can do this. You can just get a digital thermometer and check your temperature. Check it at different times of the day. They used to say check your basal body temperature. I'm less adamant of that now. Just check it anytime. Don't drink a hot liquid first or a cold liquid first, but check your body temperature and average that out. And if it's below 98.6, which it is for a lot of people, you're at high risk to have lower thyroid functioning.
Mm.
And then there are little clues and hints that you can get from person's story. For thyroid, a lot of times with thyroid, it's good to contrast things actually. So the fatigue is often related to either adrenal dysfunction, and it's usually lower cortisol or lower thyroid or both. So when you have lower cortisol, you often will feel better when you rest. When you have low thyroid, you often feel better when you get moving.
Good.
So that's a dead giveaway. Oh yeah, the more I sit around, the more tired I get. Well, would you feel better if you exercise and get up moving and get everything going? Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a sign your thyroid's not quite working well, and you get kind of moving is kind of getting the engine going a little bit.
Makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah. The other thing is on the physical body. So when you have low thyroid, you get something called myxedema, which is basically fluid building up in your system and in your cells. And it's not edema like you get when you have like a kidney failure and you push on your skin and your finger gets stuck in there and it goes in deep. That's not the thing. That's pitting edema. This is myxedema, which just basically can appear in all the same areas, but your skin looks just really thick. It looks just really thick and full of fluids and boggy. And that's something you can just see in people's face. The other thing you see in people's face is your eyebrows, especially the lateral third of your eyebrows, deteriorates with low thyroid. And that's called the sign of Hertog, after Dr. Hertog's great-grandfather, I believe.
Of course, I've just put that together. Yes.
That's from him. So yeah, that's that outer third there. And you can also get like a redness in your hands. Which is, you just look at your palms, compare them to somebody else, are they just redder? Because palms aren't naturally red.
No.
What else here? A lot of times will get a slowing down of the growing of your hair and your nails. That's a sign as well of low thyroid. And then the other thing with thyroid is poor resistance to infections, especially like flus and colds and things like that, viral infections.
what percentage, and then I want to move on to the adrenals, but when someone comes in, how many people or percentage wise do you think have their thyroid out?
Good question. Quite a few. I mean, it is the likely number. It's the number one hormonal imbalance for sure. Probably, in my pay, if you have fatigue, it's probably like 30 to 50%.
Wow. Yeah, it's a big number, and it's something that, again, like we were saying, that it gets definitely missed because people aren't doing the correct labs. So I'm really glad that you shared what labs need to be done.
Yeah,
Because unless you have that full panel, a TSH for people at home, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormones produced by the pituitary gland, it doesn't tell you what your thyroid's doing, and yet that's the standard test. It makes no sense to me. But
well, the reason they do it is because that's the only test they had up until the last 15 years or so. So historically, that's the only one they had.
Right, that's why.
Historically, also historically, they used to check a basal body temperature before they had a TSH. And historically, they gave people desiccated animal-based thyroid up until Synthroid joined the market, at which time the manufacturers of Synthroid, which is synthetic levothyroxine, or T4, up upon that, the manufacturer and marketing crew of levothyroxine created the myth that the animal-based thyroid was somehow inadequate and not standardized. That myth is still perpetuated to this day, and your doctors, I mean, your listeners out there probably have told you that if you asked them for an animal-based thyroid, oh, it's not standardized. Well, you think the FDA is allowing the pharmacies to sell a non-standardized medication? That's just silliness, right? And that's just a myth. So a lot of people who are also on thyroid medication, I would say 70 to 80% are inadequately treated.
So dive into that for me, because that must be a big issue then, because people are thinking then it's not thyroid, or they're just everything's been missed.
Yeah, so they got those symptoms we just talked about. They go to the doctor, gives them a treatment. Oh, that didn't help. Well, why? Number one, you're just taking T4, which we just talked about, the levothyroxine, as different trade names, Synthroid, or other names. But there's a couple of things. One, that's the inactive version. So your body has to convert it to active version to work. Well, in laboratory animals, that works, or in healthy humans, that works. If you're chronically ill, it might not work. Why? Because your cells aren't working. It doesn't work if you're missing iodine. It doesn't work if you have a lot of heavy metals. It doesn't work if you don't have selenium. It doesn't work. Yeah. So, and it doesn't work if you have a lot of inflammation necessarily. And there's probably other reasons which I'm forgetting now too, but it's a lot of people who fit in that category. So one, either you can't activate the T4 to the active form of T3, or you're not getting enough of the T4. So how do you know the difference? Well, you do the free T4 and the free T3 in your blood test. And if your free T4 was really low and you took T4 and it goes up and the T3 didn't change at all, then you're not converting it. And if the T4 didn't go up high enough into that upper, like 50th, 75th upper percentile there, then you're just not getting enough. Other issue. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say really good tips for people that are on this stuff, just to know. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, and these are things I see all day long. And these are from endocrinologists. These aren't just like average doctor. I mean, these are like people who you would think would know better. And the other thing you can have is you can convert the T4 into that reverse T3. And then the reverse T3 actually blocks the T3 receptor. So that's rarely checked. I mean, I see 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 patients referred to me who someone's ever checked that level on.
Yeah.
Right. So you could have everything else in your life perfect. And if that reverse T3 is elevated, you will be suffering. And you will not know why.
Yeah, no, really good tips.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about, because that was really good coverage for people that may have thought about that and what tests to get. Anything else you want to say about the thyroid? And otherwise, let's move on to the adrenals.
It's always, if you're not feeling resolution of your symptoms on T4, it's wise to try a desiccated animal-based thyroid. If you have high reverse T3, The only option is taking synthetic T3. Do not take, I haven't seen good results ever taking a T4 or an animal-based T4, T3. And it's very simple. If you take a T4, it will make more reverse T3. So you have to take T3 only to block that conversion and clear it out of your system. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's most of my tips and pearls on the thyroid. Yeah.
No, they're brilliant. So let's move into the old adrenals, because they are, like you say, a big one as well, especially with what everyone's been through in the last couple of years. So let's talk cortisol and DHEA and yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we know, you hear, studies show 90% of all illnesses created or made worse by stress. So when you say that, what does that mean? Well, I mean, stress is a million different forms. We all identify with different ones, but what it means is your stress hormones are not adequately responding. Because if your stress hormones were adequately responding, you wouldn't get an illness from the stress. It's that simple. So you break it down like that, you could say, well, doesn't everybody probably have an adrenal or stress hormone issue? If they got an illness, yeah, they almost all do. And everybody's been sold this story that they have high cortisol, and everybody freaks out about the word cortisol. When in actuality, if you have an inflammatory illness that ends in itis, it means by definition, you have low cortisol, almost always.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Because itis is inflammation. And what is cortisol? Cortisol is your natural anti-inflammatory. So when you have adequate, you don't get inflammatory illness. So physically, let's go a step back. So what do people with low cortisol look like? Thin. Hot. When the extreme version of low cortisol is you have no facial fat and you're really thin. You can imagine, and it creates an energy of like worry and anxiousness and perseverating and obsessiveness. So you could probably, anybody here could close their eyes and think of a family member or someone close to them who's thin, who overthinks everything, who can't calm down, who's a little agitated quite easily. That is low cortisol. That's what it's doing. When you don't have enough cortisol, you release excessive amounts of adrenaline. Excessive amounts of adrenaline cause anxiety, palpitations, insomnia, all the bad things that you don't want. And they also make your mind just keep racing, so you can't let things go. So when you're just going all the time. Physically, you can look at your nails, and at the end of your nails, they'd be really dark. That's low cortisol. Pigmented spots on your face, like, yeah, you can get sun exposure, but big dark discolorations on your face, that's low cortisol. Dark lines on the palms of your hand and the creases, that's low cortisol. These are all, because what it is this is ACTH, which is what you're using, which stimulates cortisol production from the adrenals. When your adrenals aren't producing enough, your body releases more of that ACTH, and it's a dark pigmented color on your skin.
You're right.
So people with low cortisol typically have more allergies. They also have more viral infections. They have more food sensitivities. Psychically, they're more sensitive to everything in their environment. They're more sensitive and aware of what's happening, and maybe feel a little bit paranoid and afraid easily. Why? Because they don't have the cortisol needed to handle the stress in their life. And every time they have a stressor, their body is releasing adrenaline, which is actually breaking down your muscle and leading you're on this catabolic, meaning muscle breakdown pattern of life, which isn't good. So, cortisol is really like a feel-good hormone. And that's why, what I was saying earlier, people with high cortisol, they're the jolly, happy storytellers who are laughing all the time because they got a lot of cortisol. Stress doesn't bother them, right? Yeah. When you parallel that, you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? So the treatment of adrenal issues and low cortisol is so complicated, and there's so many books on it because there's so many sources of stress. One, there's so many sources of stress, and Two, it comes in every flavor, and it manifests and influences all of our illnesses and aging dramatically, right? With low cortisol, we're at higher risk for all autoimmune illnesses.
Makes sense.
We're at risk for all of these, like, post-infectious inflammatory diseases that can happen, like long COVID, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome and food allergies, but also Crohn's and the cousins of Crohn's. So, it's all the things that you don't want to have that are really plaguing our society now, are working on this level. So, how do you treat it? Well, we could talk for days on that topic. Days and days and days. And, it's like the number one realization that at some point you have to come to is that stress is not outside of us. Stress is our response that we have control over. And we're the only organism on the planet that can choose our response. So on some level, we are in power. Now, it's hard to be in power when your cortisol is low and you're releasing adrenaline all the time. That puts you in a weakened, fearful state, right? So the challenge with adrenal and low cortisol is learning to take a little step back, create more space in your life, and learning what those triggers are. And it's multifactorial. You got to do your therapy, you got to do your treatments, whatever they may be. There are a lot of treatments that can work on this. You got to find those. And on the physical level, low cortisol is almost always associated with low minerals in the body. And when you don't have those minerals, then the systems get worse. For example, low magnesium and low cortisol. When you don't have enough magnesium and you have low cortisol, well, that adrenaline that you're releasing can't get degraded. Why? Because you need magnesium to break it down. So that's how, you learn your systems, and, you can make things a little better when you know your body better. You add in more selenium and zinc into your life. That'll help too when you have low cortisol. The other thing you have when you have low cortisol is you have hypoglycemia easily. So your blood sugar is bouncing up and down. The blood flow to your head is diminished due to low blood pressure. Therefore, you don't think clearly all the time. So another dead giveaway symptom of low cortisol and its cousin aldosterone, which is modulating the blood flow to the brain, is when you really have to make an important decision. Do you lay down? Do you feel better laying down? Do you feel better standing up? If you feel better laying down, that means you're not getting enough blood flow to the brain up here. Right? Really simple. So that tells us that, okay, if you stand up, your cortisol, your blood pressure just isn't high enough. So we can support that. There's a lot of herbs that can support that. Licorice supports that. There's a zillion adrenal adaptogens. Licorice will actually help raise your blood pressure. But if you have high blood pressure, you don't take it. But if you have low blood pressure, it's kind of quite good for you. Thing that's quite good when you have that low blood pressure issue, and I take this every day, and many of my patients have said this is the best thing I ever told them to do, is add liquid potassium to your water. Liquid potassium will help you release that other adrenal hormone called aldosterone, which will help raise your blood pressure and help you think more clearly. When you think more clearly, you'll be less anxious and afraid, and you'll be less perpetuating the cycle of releasing adrenaline, which is just making the cortisol worse. That's the hard part about cortisol issues, is that it begets more bad behavior, which just makes it worse. Right.
And
because
with labs, what are you looking at there? Because are bloods accurate? Or because that's my understanding too. So
let me clarify that. The lab may or may not be accurate. Some are accurate. The lab test is inaccurate for the following reason. One, do you get anxious when somebody's coming at you with a needle? Yes. Well, what did that do if you're anxious? It raised your cortisol. It just put it in the normal range. So you would have been low if they checked it. Then you just got anxious. You released cortisol and adrenaline because she's coming at you with a needle. You just got yourself up into a normal range. So when they do the draw, the doctor's going to say it looks normal. So I don't do that test on people. I mean, that's a good screening test. If it's high, it tells us something. If it's normal or low, if it's normal, it tells us nothing. If it's low, it tells us something. But normal means nothing. The best way to test your adrenals is adrenal stress index using a salivary cortisol test, where you're doing at least 4 different tests over the course of a day.
Mhm.
The convenience of your own home under a normal stressful circumstance. Please don't do that test like when you go to the one day of the year you go to the local monastery, meditate all day. No, you want to see what it looks like under normal conditions, right? Because you're trying to figure out what it normally looks like. That answer your question, Fiona?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So it's definitely the saliva spit test, which is what we would use in clinic as well. So, and again, how many GPs and doctors are using those tests? None
More
that I
and
know.
more, I think more and more are now.
Okay.
Surprisingly, people are getting the message around this. They're realizing that a lot of people, there are a lot of people walking around with real Addison's disease that aren't being treated. And Addison's is like, means you've got like 10% of normal cortisol production. So you're really struggling at that point. And so again, treatment options as far as like pure treatments go, there's several classes. One is herbal treatments, and that's everything from ashwagandha, ginseng, rhodiola, eleutherococcus, or any of the, there's 500 more. And there's 500 different formulas, and some will work for a period of time and then they won't. There's also animal glandular extracts for adrenals. Those are very good. You can also get these adrenal oral bioregulators, the Russian oral bioregulators. Those are very good. You must stabilize your blood sugar if you ever want your adrenals to get better. So you can do, there's many formulas for that. There is also the option that no one talks about and no one wants to talk about, but often works really well, is oral hydrocortisone. So you can actually take just a supplement to make the difference of between the amount you make of cortisone and the amount you should make. So, an average, average person, you should be making this much cortisone. If you have low production, you're only making this. So you just you get a doctor to give you just that much to fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And if they give you just that much to fill in the blank, it does not cause suppression of your hormones. Another myth. Sure, it might knock it down a little percentage, but it's not going to kill your adrenals. If you stop it, they're going to go back to the same number, not going to be negatively impacted. I've had many patients I've treated for over a decade with hydrocortisone with good results. There's a very good book on this subject called The Safe Uses of Cortisol. And this guy was a pharmaceutical researcher, and I believe he published in the 50s or 60s. This guy was curing all kinds of illnesses using hydrocortisone. And then after that, they came out with prednisone. They stopped using hydrocortisone, and then all the bad press of cortisone came out. And now everybody associates cortisone or cortisol with prednisone.
They do, yeah.
Here, I'm not talking about using prednisone here. I don't use prednisone almost under any circumstance. It's a very dangerous drug it's way overprescribed. If instead of using prednisone, doctors prescribed hydrocortisone, they would get much better results and the side effects would go away almost completely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So and in Australia, definitely no GPs are using salivas unless they're integrated. So how do you have a conversation with your GP, with the thyroid and the adrenals? Because people are like, okay, well, these two are big. Really, everybody should be checked for them every year is, my opinion, especially as we age and we get more used to some of these aging diseases. And I'll let you speak to hormones and aging because I think that's important too. But how do you, and you said something great before we started the recording, but how do you get your GPs on board with trying to get some of these tests done?
Good question. First off, some doctors are so little knowledge of this and are so reactive to the conversation that no matter what you say, it's not going to work. So the first thing is, if you're in that situation, get a new doctor. People stop going to bad doctors, they go out of business. or they educate themselves. That's how we can change our system, is if people stop accepting bad care. Now, I know I'm in a privileged situation. I know not everyone can choose. I mean, I know there's some people in rural areas, they don't have choices and they don't have funds, and I get that. So I'm exaggerating this a bit. If you can have the conversation, I always say educate yourself the best. Now, having said that, some doctors have such inferiority complexes that when you know more than them, they get pissed off and they freak out and they tell you to leave. And I've had patients tell me that recently. The doctors, they're doing that now. Something happened with COVID now, and doctors have lost all their manners and beds. I can't believe what patients are telling me now they're hearing. Like, I'm like, really? Like, they said that in your off? Like, wow. So you're going to come across people like that, and you can't persuade, some people. So if you can find a new doctor and try to interview your doctor like you're, interviewing, somebody important in your life, and realize that you do often have a choice in the matter, and you can keep interviewing until you find the right one. The first thing is education. Again, know what labs you want, have these labs written down and say, doctor, I'm suspicious of this. I've read the books, and I know that maybe I don't have the classical symptoms of thyroid, but I understand there's some people who have little different labs that might still qualify for treatment according to some world organizations. And I've read all those studies, and hey, I'd be wondering if you'd just be willing to help me out and run these tests.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I like to approach it. The adrenal stress index, yeah, you're right. Good luck getting a GP. They won't even know how to order it unless they already do it. So that's part of the interview process. Is, this is a better tip, is, okay, doctor, I'm considering becoming your patient. If you were going to check a thyroid panel for me, which labs would you order? And if they didn't list off the ones that I just mentioned to you, then you could say, well, in my research, I think that these all should be ordered. Would you be willing to do that for me? Yes or no? And if it's a no, then you just go to the next one.
Yeah.
That might be a better approach, because it might take some searching to find that right person.
Sure.
But doctors are I say they're coming around because I'm in these different organizations, and I mentor some doctors who are learning, and a lot of people are fed up, and so we're getting a lot of these old school doctors who are now trying to learn what we're talking about here, and they don't know the answer either. They don't. So they're going to make these same mistakes, even if they call themselves integrative, but they're open to learning. They're open to realizing that there is a different way to look at it. They really are. So good luck there. And then, in the US now, there's several options. I don't know if you have this in Australia yet, but like there's a company called Rupa Health, RUPA Health, and you can go on there and order any freaking test on the planet, pretty much.
That's amazing.
And they've organized doctors. So if your doctor doesn't order it or won't order it, they organize other doctors that'll do it for you or order it for you. And so that's a very valuable service now. So you can get information. I mean, I understand it might be country specific, but for people here in the US, for sure that's an option. And I bet there is some company in Australia that has some options like that.
There are. We've got a few different ones, and definitely naturopaths can prescribe a lot of these. So Now the other hormone I really want to get you to dive into is melatonin, because I feel like that one definitely declines with age, and it's so related to so many things. And I think as a population, people are really onto it, but I feel like it's another one that GPs aren't testing a lot. So do you, tell me more about melatonin and its role in
good question, Fiona. I was getting excited pulling my book here because I found some resources on melatonin. I'll read a couple out here to you.
Okay.
So melatonin, senescence associated with the decline of the pineal melatonin axis. This is from Dr. Hertog's book. And he's got 6 good articles right there showing the association between low melatonin and an increased aging process. Then he's talking about The other thing that we know for sure is that with a decline in melatonin production, you get a decline in antioxidant production. When you get a decline in antioxidant production, you get increased reactive oxygen species. We know reactive oxygen species that's one of those pillars of aging. So anything that increases those reactive oxygen species will increase senescence in that mTOR pathway that we talked about at the middle of all aging. The failure of repair systems, melatonin reduces damage and accelerates repair. So, when we're sleeping, why do we sleep? Well, everybody says, well, you heal and repair while you're sleeping. Well, melatonin helps you do that. So your melatonin's decline, you're going to have less repair. In the term for that's autophagy, right? That's the cellular repair. So when you don't have enough melatonin, you're not having enough cellular repair. What does that mean? If you don't have enough cellular repair, it means your cells are aging faster. They're more likely to turn into cancer cells and more likely to turn into these senescent zombie cells we talked about last time. And who has the lowest melatonin levels? The elderly, those who can't sleep at all, those who need it the most, those who have all these senescent cells who are coming to that curve we talked about last week, where all of a sudden they're getting so much senescence. So that's the extreme version of low melatonin, right? Melatonin stimulates the immune system. And that's critical. So for, a lot of people with COVID and long COVID, we talked about taking melatonin. Why? Because it has an antioxidant benefit. It's lowering some of those cytokine storm, and it's improving your immune system across the board. I've waffled in my career using melatonin. I used to use a lot of it, then I stopped for a while. With all the COVID and long COVID, I've come back to use it again. My sleep is definitely improved by large percentage since I've started retaking melatonin. And when you take melatonin, it's important the difference. If you take a pill by mouth, you have to multiply the dose by about 10x over if you take a sublingual form. So if you take a sublingual form, you get through by like half to 1 milligram or even lower. And if you take it orally, you're going to need somewhere usually in the 5 to 10 milligram range.
Yeah, good tip there, because I often find people don't get quite enough. It was banned in Australia for the longest time. We've only just.
Wow.
I know. No, you couldn't. You have to get it prescribed, but you can only now just buy it over the counter if you're over 60.
What? Wow.
Yeah.
They're checking IDs to sell melatonin. Wow.
So my mum goes and gets it for me.
Melatonin and psychic well-being, lower quality of life and fatigue with lower melatonin levels. Higher fatigue with lower melatonin levels. And he's got 20 studies on that.
Wow.
On fatigue and melatonin. Depression and low melatonin. 13 studies. 13 plus 7 more.
Yeah, there you go.
It's 7 studies showing that the depression gets better when you take melatonin. Anxiety, 10 more studies. Memory loss, Alzheimer's disease, sleep disorders. And then he's got all these age-related diseases from hypertension, which is, of course, impacting your kidneys. He's got arterial hypertension and improvement with melatonin. 20 studies on that.
Wow.
Cardiac disease and lower melatonin, 8 studies on that. Stroke and low melatonin. Diabetes and low melatonin. Yeah, so it's, and in cancer, I think there's a lot of research too, showing that cancer patients specifically. Well, guess what? If a cancer patient needs melatonin, then what is it doing? It's probably preventing cancer too.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Very
Don't
powerful.
really need studies to prove that. If something, one of my good friends, Eric Gordon, who's a genius doctor, he says something. If something helps an ill person, it's probably going to help a healthy person even more.
Yeah,
it's
good
sense, right? If it helps somebody who's ill, it's and it's in the natural category, meaning it's not like a side effect laden, pharmaceutical chemotherapy agent. It's probably going to help healthy people as well.
And tell me again, let's go to testing with melatonin. Are the bloods accurate? How would you test that?
No, the only test I've seen that's accurate is only, I think there are some urine tests you can do that are accurate. I do order those tests, but I don't order them specifically to check low melatonin. I don't use a lab test. I just prescribe it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And the other hormone you mentioned before we jumped on the call that I also want to put in there, because I think it's important, is the oxytocin, because it's not, people just think it's a breastfeeding one and no one talks about it, but it's our love, connection, our social bonding hormone. And you know, you were talking before about its relationship to as we age and it goes down, and depression and things like that. And of course, you know, the population that doesn't feel connected and in a community, and you know, we know that they die earlier and all of those sort of things. So tell me a bit more about oxytocin, because again, it's not one that anyone's talking about. I don't know anyone that tests it.
Yeah, I don't think that there's no testing that I know.
No.
Yeah, and I learned it from Dr. Hertog. I started prescribing it like 10, 15 years ago. Also because I had a lot of patients who were in the sex tantra teachers and all of these sexual wellness coaches, and they would come to me and man, they tell you everything. And I got problems with this. And Dr. Hertog's like, oxytocin helps all these things. So I started prescribing a great result. So but in research for this topic today, I just let me look up oxytocin and its association with senescence. And in so doing, I found there are quite a few studies showing the connection. And so then I was like, okay, let's just take a step back. So we know, oxytocin, for those of you, let me paint a picture of oxytocin.
Yeah.
So picture of oxytocin, we can think of the mother who's breastfeeding, because that's the image that comes to mind immediately for most people. So it's the hormone that you release when you're happy. It's the hormone you release when nipples are stimulated, either sexually or by breastfeeding. It's also the hormone that increases vaginal lubrication for women. It's the hormone that allows a woman to orgasm. It's the hormone that makes you feel connected to others. It is a hormone that is increased when someone hits a like on your Facebook page. True story. Good studies on that. When you feel any connection at all to someone, your oxytocin level goes up a bit. It is a feed-forward hormone, unlike almost all the others, meaning the more oxytocin you have, the more you will make.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
When you really low, you get really stuck in despair. So low oxytocin, on the other hand, think of COVID isolation, for example. Alone, lonely, no touch. Touch increases oxytocin. So no touch, no pleasure, just like the joy of life and connection to others has just been sucked away. And like you said earlier, Fiona, we know that when you are depressed, clear studies on men, when they're alone and depressed, they die of everything very quickly. Clear studies on that, like clear studies on men whose wife dies. If they're depressed and alone, they die very quickly. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to say if we just gave them oxytocin, it'd all cure their issues, but that is part of it. So this is also why it's critical that, all that we've gone through the last few years, we actually go out and meet people and we touch people, and we don't, the way society's going now is this isolationist, computer technology driven, everything where you're always on the computer and there's no human interaction. Well, that human interaction is what produces the oxytocin. And touch is what produces oxytocin. Sexual activity and engagement increases the oxytocin. You can also take oxytocin. It's very interesting. Now, oxytocin clinically is what is given when a woman can't go into childbirth. So it's what you use to induce childbirth. They give it by IV. If you take the IV form of it, and I've done this, I get no benefit from it. I don't notice anything at all.
Yeah, right.
When I take it sublingually, I immediately get a calming, like, just a sense of calmness and ease, and everything's going to be okay, and openness to the person in front of me. It has a very good, it also will make orgasms much more pleasurable and allow men and women to have multiple orgasms. It, again, when you're really low, if you take it, you will take you a long time to notice it's working because you don't have any. So you got to build receptors for it, and it has to give time for it to work. So I like to give it sublingually, and I tell people it is not absorbed at all when you swallow it. So
Yeah, right.
you hold it in your mouth, like, I mean, literally 5 or 10 minutes if you want it to work.
And is it one that doctors will prescribe? Because it's, again, it's, I think, and I could be wrong here, most doctors are just thinking it's to bring on childbirth. I don't think I know any doctor that's just out prescribing sublingual oxytocin for depression and people that have been through COVID and isolation. I just haven't heard of it.
There aren't many of us, but the more people that hear about it like this and go to their doctors and say, oh, I heard about this, you plant seeds in the doctor's head, maybe they read an article on it, or maybe they're just a good doctor who listens to their patients and goes and researches it and says, oh yeah, maybe there is something useful. Right.
And again, for you, there was no lab test with it. So you're just looking at maybe people that are, would you look at circumstantial sort of stuff, people that have been isolated and alone and not getting all of that connection and touch and that sort of.
Absolutely. I mean, low oxytocin. I mean, Dr. Hertog, his specialty, as I was telling you earlier, Fiona, is diagnosing hormone imbalances by just looking at people. Now, of course, we do lab tests to confirm that, but you're pretty darn good at, just looking at people. The low oxytocin person is the social, it's almost like autism. You don't want to look anybody in the eye, like you're looking to the side, you're just very withdrawn and distant. Right. And the high oxytocin is a very loving, open person who's smiling and just looking at you, nothing to hide, and just there and present with you. So it doesn't necessarily take a lab test to show that. The good thing about oxytocin is there are no side effects from, if you take too much, here are the side effects. One, if you take too much, if as a man, your sexual performance will decline. Right. If you take too much. If you take too much chronically, and I've seen this before, it will lower your cortisol. So if you're very low cortisol already and you take too much of it too regularly, your cortisol will come down and you'll get stressed and anxious as a consequence. So you can still use it if you have a low cortisol, you just don't use as much nor as frequently. The other side effect of it is you have to be careful who you use it with. It will increase bonding. If you use it to increase bonding to someone you don't like, you will put yourself in a bad relationship.
Good to know.
Oxytocin is what you release when you're in love. So if you're stimulating that artificially, be careful of the person you're sitting in front of you taking it with you. Right.
Very good tip there. Now, is there any other hormones that you wanted to cover? I know oxytocin and melatonin a little bit sideways, but I wanted you to cover them because they're ones that people just aren't thinking about, and everything that we've been, especially melatonin, of how important that is. But oxytocin, I think there's probably a lot of people with low oxytocin after coming through COVID and isolation. But any other hormones that jump out that you feel like you want to cover, or that we need to sort of talk about?
To finish the oxytocin, most of you aren't going to be able to get it clinically. You can touch more people. Physical touch more people. If you're a man and you want to arouse your partner, if she likes to have her nipples stimulated, that actually increases oxytocin production. So that regularly will help, actually. More touch, getting some massage, massaging your partner. These all, looking at your partner's eyes, creating more depth. Now, it is a catch-22 that when you're withdrawn, you don't want to do these things. When your oxytocin's higher, you do want to. So you might have to push through that barrier a bit.
Makes sense.
So that's in the oxytocin. Estrogen, estrogen gets such a bad rap. Everybody's so afraid of it. When you have low estrogen, you're more risk for dementia, osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease. When you have low testosterone, you're at higher risk for depression, anxiety, insomnia, more pain, more aggressive types of prostate cancer. And all of these, I mean, the estrogen is clear, it's like when your estrogen's low and you're a woman, you really, there is no herbal substitute for estrogen. There is no way when you need estrogen, if you want to delay your aging, if you're curious why that 75-year-old favorite actress of yours looks so gorgeous, it's because she takes estrogen. Guaranteed.
There you
Guaranteed.
go.
All of the people you see and admire who are beautiful past like 40 years old, they're all taking hormones. I know, because why? Most of the doctors I learned from are in California, because that's where all these people start with. And I treated quite a few in the movie star realm, and and they're of course all taking this. Absolutely. You want your facial skin to look great? Estrogen. Estrogen works great. For women, when your estrogen drops, it's really easy. Things just start drooping in your body. Skin sagging, breasts, skin, etc. Also, you get lines over your face, these like vertical lines that you can see sometimes in women. That's a sign of low estrogen. Your hair starts falling straighter, it's less full and plump. Of course, you get the hot flashes and night sweats, but those are the other more subtle signs, or your hair doesn't grow as quickly as another one. Less vaginal lubrication with sex, less libido, these sorts of things. And you don't have to be, you don't have to like be super aggressive with the treatment. They do have good estrogen patches now, which are just estradiol patches, and those work very well. Those work very, very well for a lot of women. So I do recommend those a lot. Yeah. And I treat. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, just talk to the fear about it, because obviously people are scared of estrogen and it's linked to breast cancer and things like that. So alleviate that for people, because people are like, oh, if I take this, am I going to increase my risk of breast cancer and cervical cancer and ovarian cancer?
Yeah, good question. There was a famous UCSF geneticist who wrote a book, and I can't remember the name of the book now, nor her name. But when I first started my career, she was a geneticist specializing in breast cancer. Kelly's her last name. Let me see if I can find the name of that book for your audience. I sent her many patients who were worried about taking estrogens, even some with personal history of breast cancer, family history of breast cancer. As long as it was past 5 years of negative on the breast cancer front personally, she never once told any of my patients they couldn't take estrogen.
Okay.
So UCSF geneticist. Let me see if I can find her name. If somebody will put it in the comments.
Yeah.
So that's one. Two, what you really have to be careful of the hormones, and there's so much complexity with all this, that we can't get into with our time limits. But here's one big one with estrogen. Estradiol is one of the main hormones. There's another one called estrone. Estrone is the inflammatory estrogen. So when your estrone is high, you get breast tenderness, you get angry, you get irritable, you get what people might say in plays, this is the bitchy, meaning just hyper aggressive with your verbal language, react. And that is the hormone that is more likely leading to cancer. So when you're looking at estrogen, you do check the estrone levels. So if your estrone levels are up here and your estradiol levels are here, you're more likely to get cancer whether you take estradiol or not. So if you want to lower your cancer risk, you bring the estrone down and you raise the estradiol up. So that's relatively easy. There's a lot of herbal protocols for that. Iodine can help with that. There are good studies from UCLA from decades ago showing taking iodine will lower your breast cancer risk, especially if you have low thyroid disease.
Yes.
Lower your cancer risk by up to 25%. If that was a medication, everyone would hear about it. So you can take a Lugol solution, like 1 or 2 drops a day. Yeah. So that's the key, is once you get into the hormones, you have to educate yourself and work with an educated physician And if your physician isn't educated, you have to be to know what to do. So if you get your, it doesn't have to be perfect. Estradiol's here, estrone needs to be below the estradiol. That's not ideal. That's not the textbook, but yeah, it just needs to be make sure that the opposite is not a good place to be. Go ahead.
No, it's really good tips. And what I'm hearing really when it comes to hormones, you have to work with a practitioner that knows what they're doing, that's testing, that's checking all of that stuff. With hormones is not something that you can really just guess and do yourself because of the way hormones work and things like that. So that's a big tip there, is needing to work with someone that knows what they're doing around that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and luckily in the last 15 years, there are a huge number, at least here in the US, who are studying this. There's a huge number of naturopaths who are really good with this. I used to treat, I don't treat so many women with HRT now because I think most women do better with a woman treating them, but I had to for years because there wasn't anybody else, and I still do, but there are many, many, many good doctors doing this now. Yeah, and the key is if you're going to do it, you got to do it right. Yeah, otherwise you are at risk.
Yeah.
And the other thing, well, we can conclude with this, but this is what you and I started with earlier before, is, if we all, like, sometimes this all stuff gets really complicated and, and you get all these studies on aging and you get all these different opinions and, and things can get quite complicated and argumentative and all this. And, I like to just think from a commonsensical standpoint. So around hormones, this just makes a lot of sense for me. And anecdotal, it's just anecdotal, but it makes so much sense. Close your eyes and imagine, like, what does someone in perfect health look like to you? What age are they? What does their skin look like? What do their muscle tone look like? What do they look like? And, we get that person and we do a lab test on them. What are their hormones going to look like? Their hormones are going to be perfect. They're going to be in the upper percentile that Dr. Hertog's talking about. They're not going to have low thyroid. They're not going to have this, that, and the other, because if they did, they wouldn't look perfect. So the physical appearance is impacted by the hormones, and then the hormones impact the internal organs and all the cellular mechanisms too associated with aging. So it's like as within, as without. So it's like, the outer will be reflected there too. So, and also you think of that person in perfect health. What age are they? They're probably, like 25 to 30 years old. Do those people get cancer? Do you get cancer when you're in perfect health at age 25 to 30? Sure, there are rare cases that happens. There's exceptions to everything, but in general, no, that's not who gets cancer. Do those people fall over dead of heart attacks? No, they don't. So, when you hear studies about, hormones cause this, that, or the other, well, you know what? If hormones cause those, then why are people who have the highest levels of hormones healthiest and don't have the illnesses? And yet the illnesses manifest in the age groups of people who have the lowest hormones. Like, okay, here, doc, like, let's don't like it too, if you just really look at it from that commonsensical perspective, it's really easy to see why hormones are probably good for most people.
Yeah. And it brings me back. Yeah. And it brings me back to, I think every year I've sort of, when you get to late 30s, early 40s, to get your hormones checked, because the earlier you get onto them and keeping them balanced, it's obviously prevention better than cure, as you and I definitely know. So
absolutely. And to that, you raised a very good point, Fiona. So even if you don't want to get your hormones treated, you want to know where they are when you're in that perfect image. So if you close your eyes, when were you in perfect health? What did you look like? What age was that? If you could go back and do like this Dutch hormone panel or a very good 24-hour urine hormone analysis of your hormones, and you put that in your file and you save that for the rest of your life, and you ever have any health issues, you carry it to your doctor and say, that's where I was in perfect health. Get me back there.
Yeah.
So when they give you hormones, that's this, forget the lab normal. The lab normal's population, if you had that snapshot when you were in perfect health, then you know what your perfect number is. And that's what I'm doing with my patients every day. I don't know what that perfect number is, but I know what their body looked and felt like because they tell me when it was perfect. And as long as they have these funny little symptoms, I know I'm not there yet. And so I'm constantly trying to figure it out so we get in place. So for example, and we can conclude with this if we want, but if I have a man who comes in and he was like, a computer guy and he never was athletic, and we're concerned about his testosterone level, for example, and we look at the normal range and say he comes back at like just barely above normal, and we say, okay, let's give him treatment. Well, the treatment for him might be just getting him back to the middle of the range. Why do I say that? Because I want to get back to where, again, he was physiologically optimal. Now that might be, say 500 might be perfect for him. And the next guy who comes in, freaking, professional boxer. He comes in, he's like, doc, I feel horrible. I can't get any muscles. I'm tired, blah, blah, blah. And I check his testosterone. He might be at 500. That might be his level that day. And I'm like, well, you know what? You're at 500. Everybody says you're normal, but you used to be at 1200 or 1500. Let's see what happens when we push you up there. We get him up to 1000. All of a sudden his muscles grow back. He's sleeping at night. He's no longer depressed. So that's the complexity of the hormones and the complexity of that lab range. Yeah.
That's really good. That's really good. And, just to reiterate that, and what you said with thyroid is the lab ranges come up of them just sampling a population. That's not a healthy population or an ideal population. That's just, and we look at our population now, no wonder our reference ranges don't reflect health. They just reflect function. And that's not what we're aiming for. We're aiming for optimal health. So that's a really good tip there. So perfect. Well, I think that was a really good discussion. And I know we didn't cover every hormone, but we'd be here all day if we did. But I think the big takeaway is if working with a really good doctor every year to get your hormones checked, because they play such a critical role and cascade and snowball into so many different areas with chronic disease. And I don't think that they're often looked at that way, because we get so segmented into, we treat the kidneys with just the kidneys, we treat the heart with just all of that. But all of these other, endocrine glands and organs and stress and thyroid and everything, and how that plays in there. Sometimes you need to correct all of that to get everything else to go back into their normal ranges too.
Exactly. And there's one good point, one way to look at that, for example, a diabetic patient, a type 2 diabetic patient, perhaps some of your listeners with a kidney, a CKD, right? And their creatinines come way down. Okay, so you've got type 2 diabetes, which means you have higher percentage of fat, lower percentage of muscle. What does that mean? I guarantee your testosterone's low. Why? Because when your testosterone's high, your muscle goes up, your fat comes down, as long as your estrogen's balanced, a little caveat there. But if you correct the testosterone and you go to the gym and work out, you create muscle. What does muscle do? Muscle is insulin sensitive. It lowers the insulin resistance that caused the diabetes in the first place. And then you don't need as many medications and you come back to health.
Exactly.
That same may or may not have a low-level thyroid issue. You treat the low-level thyroid issue, get the thyroid dialed in a little better, their blood sugar comes down. Why? Because their metabolism goes up with the higher thyroid. So blood sugar comes down a little bit. Those glycosylated end products that are damaging the kidneys come down. Blood pressure comes down. So that's how, this is all clinically applicable. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, really good point. And if anyone wants to work with Dr. Morgan Camp, I'll put his web address in there below. If you Google his name, he'll come up. I know you're busy working on programs and things so you can help more people, but he is one man. So his team will get back to you when they can. And he's a very busy man. So again, thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom. It's always amazing and greatly appreciated. And just how you can put complex things together and bring it back, and really looking at treating someone as a whole and looking at all of this and putting this all together, moving pieces with the human body is really amazing. So thank you. If you Want to get notified anytime we put up new videos, Dr. Camp and I are going to do definitely some more. Make sure you hit subscribe. If you want to know more about what we do, head to www.kidneycoach.com. You can also find us on Facebook/kidney coach. Thank you for being part of our community. We hope you found this useful, and we hope now that a lot of you will go out and get your hormones tested every year. We highly recommend it. Until next time, thanks again. Thank you, Dr. Camp. Bye.